We're gathering in the face of a climate and biodiversity emergency. We've declared our concern and we want to act, and we've got a COVID curveball to deal with as well. How should we be building with wood when all this is going on? You'll see it everywhere. Wood is good. Wood, the ultimate renewable. Responsible wood. Make it wood. Well, contrary to popular belief and some heavy marketing, timber can be the very best or the very worst material you'll work with as a builder, and it depends all on where and how it's sourced. Sourced sensitively, it can store carbon through and beyond the service life of construction. It can be reused or recycled, or it can be harvested from deliberately planted and sensitively managed forest, helping maintain healthy ecological processes, sequestering carbon from the atmosphere and contributing to the social and economic well-being of rural communities. But if it's harvested insensitively, it can result in serious and irreversible impacts on flora and fauna, soil health and waterways. It can reduce or even reverse a forest system's sequestration of atmospheric carbon, and it can erode the well-being of rural and Indigenous communities. If our kids are going to enjoy lives worth living, and if we see ourselves as part of the natural world, then we also need to appreciate forests as our most vital organ. Their soils and vegetation hold most of the carbon existing on the surface of our entire living planet. They play a huge part in controlling our climate and our rain across the world, and they provide habitat and food for a rich web of invertebrate and vertebrate animals, as well as for Indigenous people of the forests. Yet, in the name of progress and lifestyle, we resign ourselves to global heating, mid-latitude desertification, and the ever-increasing rate at which our forests are burnt and cleared. And we do that at the peril of our very existence. We all know about these unstoppable bushfires that are wreaking havoc through the Russian boreal forests, even in the coldest parts of the world, the Amazon rainforests, our own Black Summer eucalypt forests, and America's West Coast conifer forests. Together they combine to add 20% to global greenhouse gas emissions at the moment. Far too much of the structural and architectural timber that we specify or we use in Australia is sourced in ways that directly and indirectly feed this terrible spiral of global heating, desertification, and forest demise. And then there's also the laundering of illegally harvested forest woods. Now, I'd like to talk a bit about the forest types from where good and bad woods for your essential construction applications, where they're sourced, where they come from. Let's start with timbers for structural framing and concrete formwork. Over the past 5 years or so, our big chain trade and retail timber yards have, in on and off waves, they've shifted their supply of softwood framing timber away from fast-grown radiata pine, which is from temperate climate Australia or New Zealand plantations, and they've moved towards slow-grown Baltic pine or spruce, much of it from cold climate native conifer and broadleaf forests of Russia and the Baltic states. In these yards, timber yards, and on the racks, you'll see Baltic pine and radiata pine stocked and sold as the very same framing wood as MGP 10 or MGP 12 pine. No indication anywhere in the yard or on the wood as to the country of origin, and one price, the same for both. But take a squiz at the end grain and it'll tell you the story, because each growth ring represents a year in the life of a tree, as we know. The 90 by 35 rift-sawn sticks of Baltic pine on the bottom right of your screen, they show an average 90 years of growth just in those sticks of wood, and that's slow. Judging from the curvature of these growth rings, I'd say this wood has been milled from a log that grew to maybe 250 to 300 millimetre diameter in around 90 to 120 years at best. The yield of millable wood from a log of this small diameter would be miserable. The same size rift-sawn sticks of radiata pine, so it's the top left of your screen, they were grown and milled within a few hours' drive of Melbourne, Colac. They show an average 9 years of growth. That's fast. So this wood has been milled from a log that grew to maybe 450 to 500 millimetres in diameter in around 25 to 30 years. In Scandinavia, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, much of this Baltic pine and spruce is sourced from land which, over centuries, has gradually transitioned from biologically rich broadleaf and conifer forests to single or dual species conifer-only tree crops of limited biodiversity value. The more troubling thing is that the big timber companies from these wealthy Western European countries, they also operate huge mills in less wealthy countries to the east, where they draw wood from more intact and biodiverse deciduous broadleaf and conifer forests. Exactly where the wood originates that's imported by these companies into Australia is kept frustratingly opaque. The sporadic dominance of Baltic pine and spruce for stick framing in Australia is all about money. So there's fluctuations in global supply and international exchange rates, and there's price wars that the big boys from abroad tend to win. New Zealand exports 90% of its millable yield of plantation pine to Asia in log form, meanwhile Australian softwood mills are closing down due to eroded market share. So the argument that we need Baltic pine and spruce from the other side of the planet to fulfil local demand, it just doesn't wash with me. For goodness sake, probably Victoria's biggest sawmill of local plantation pine is about 40 kilometres up the road from this Bunnings Stores and Warren Ponds. The current rate of deforestation of Northern Hemisphere boreal forests, or the taiga, it's the largest terrestrial biome and carbon sink on the planet. This deforestation will have a catastrophic impact on our global climate if it continues. Unless the taiga is preserved to remain intact as largely virgin forest, this biome will soon become a net carbon emitter that alone will dwarf our ever-increasing human emissions. By reducing tree cover, industrial-scale logging of the taiga accelerates climate change because the nutrient-rich forest soil decomposes under elevated solar radiation with that exposure. That releases carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, which it does most dramatically in the most northern regions with permafrost. And that then also impoverishes the biological and moisture profile of soil, slowing and compromising the return of healthy tree cover via natural or planted regeneration. Repressed regrowth invites invasion of other species, providing ladder fuel for more frequent and intense wildfires. So it's a potent feedback loop of forest degradation and greenhouse gas emission. Meanwhile, we've got millable radiata, panaster and slash pine growing in vast, high-yielding plantations across cool and warm temperate climate zones of Australia, in all states and territories except the Northern Territory. And across the ditch in New Zealand, we've got millable radiata pine and Oregon that are grown to quality and quantity that dwarfs ours in Australia. New Zealand has a long and impressive history in silviculture or tree farming. Yet much of this millable wood from our region goes to wood chip due to global price wars and just-in-time procurement mantra. So guys, please insist that the pine delivered to your sites is from fast-grown plantations of Australia or New Zealand. Here's an easy-to-follow info sheet from the website that you can find for Mullen Creek Eco Housing Project in Victoria. It'll help you and your suppliers distinguish between the good pines and the bad pines. Also, please do the same when you order prefabricated floor, wall and roof trusses. If your jobs are in Victoria, here's a Mullen Creek info sheet that'll help you with that. Now, let's look at engineered framing timbers, LVL, glulam, plywood for bracing, OSB and CLT. These days, I'm struggling to see anywhere on building sites, in Victoria at least, LVL that's not from the other side of the planet. Your dominant Tilling Smart LVL, your Murphy LVL and Rigid Lam LVL are manufactured mainly from Oregon, growing slowly in a mix of cold climate native regrowth forests and plantations of the northwest United States and southwest Canada. Most of the rest of the LVL you'll see on jobs, spec beam, MT LVL and Ultra Lam, they're all Baltic pine, spruce or larch from Europe, the Baltic states and Siberia. Till now you might have seen the odd job around with that yellow LVL that's manufactured in New Zealand from fast-grown plantation pine that's clearly branded as high-span LVL. But that LVL plant is now closing thanks to the global price wars I mentioned earlier. For builders in southern Australian states, that leaves only Wesbeam LVL, which is manufactured in Western Australia from laminates of local plantation maritime pine and radiata pine, but now also, to lift its strength and stiffness, native forest carry. So that carry, it's not from plantation, as Wesbeam's marketing videos would have us believe. I'm currently trying to encourage the other two New Zealand manufacturers of LVL, so Nelson Pine and J&L, to supply pure plantation pine LVL, not only to New South Wales and Queensland, but also to Australia's southern states. But until then, Wesbeam LVL might be the best for you southern builders. Also, oddly, Wesbeam LVL products for concrete formwork, so E-form and E-edge, they're still manufactured without laminates of carry included. So they're perfectly good to use. Have a look how beautifully LVL from local plantation pine has been used for this museum in New Zealand. So it's a striking and huge building. For reasons I'll cover shortly, avoid glulam products from Australian native forests, eucalyptus and cypress pine. Obviously also avoid those from Northern Hemisphere Baltic pine, spruce and larch. Stick to glulam from Australian or New Zealand grown plantation wood. Now all of that thinner, darker hardwood bracing ply that you'll see around the traps, that's manufactured in Southeast Asia from slow-growing hardwoods of tropical rainforest, whether it's Fsc certified or not. So on the left and the right side of your screen, you'll see that ply. I'm sure you've seen it around a lot. There's now also a rapidly increasing amount of unbranded plywood for formwork, structural and architectural applications sold in Australia that's from pine plantations in Chile, and it's all unbranded. Aside from the carbon miles attached to its importation and the serious wildfires that these plantations have whipped right into major cities of that country, you could argue that these price-competitive plantation plywoods from countries with cheap labour are sustainably sourced. But I prefer to go with branded Carter Holt Harvey Eco Ply that's manufactured in New South Wales from local plantation pine for floor cassettes, panel bracing and other structural applications. And Carter Holt Harvey Formrite, which is manufactured in New Zealand from local plantation pine again, for concrete form shuttering. The price is much the same in the scheme of things. So as a structural, as a panel bracing there, you can see it in the middle of the screen, the Eco Ply. OSB. All OSB you'll see in Australia, whether as bracing, substrate or webbing in engineered product like Wesbeam E-joists, is, as far as I know, manufactured by international giants Egger and Swiss Kronel out of Baltic pine and spruce, sourced from across Europe and into Russia. So stick with local eco-ply for these applications and you'll do at least Australian workers and our climate a favour. Cross-Laminated Timber, or CLT, is now all the rage for green builds. But way too much CLT that finds its way onto Australian project sites is still fabricated by big business in Europe from slow-grown Baltic pine and spruce. Meanwhile, in New Zealand, companies like Xlam have for well over a decade fabricated CLT for sizable and impressive buildings from local, fast-growing plantation radiata pine. More recently, CLT plants sourcing local plantation radiata pine have been set up by Xlam on the Victorian-New South Wales border, by Cross-Lam in WA, and by CLTP in Tasmania. CLTP and Timberlink are looking to source shining gum, or Eucalyptus nitens, to increase the structural performance of their CLT and glulam. This shining gum has been super fast grown in Tasmanian plantations in only 10 to 15 years and was originally intended for the fickle wood chip industry. This is a much better outcome to put it into CLT. So going forward, please support CLTP for your CLT and Timberlink for your glulam if you can. As builders, I appreciate that if and when a CLT project comes to you, much of the construction detail will probably already be locked in. But CLT builds that I see around the traps are too often also awfully wasteful in their consumption of wood. Here, you've got a 2-storey home in Tasmania with essentially 2 homes worth of wood in its construction system. So one house worth of wood is in the CLT itself. Here it's from European Baltic and spruce. And another is in the stick frame. Again, it looks to be Baltic pine and spruce. Beside the CLT, just to provide cavities, or mainly to provide cavities, for thermal insulation and services. If only the upper floor joists and the roof rafters were beefed up a whisker, there'd be no structural or thermal or any other functional purpose that I can think of to the CLT whatsoever. So if you can, don't let your clients and their architects waste wood and money in this way. For taller builds, where CLT has structural merit, most floor, wall and ceiling surfaces will be battened and lined to provide service cavities, insulation between thermal compartments, and of course a weather-resistant skin for external walls and roofs. So for a client who insists on the appearance of CLT in spruce, which has those finer pin knots, stick with locally grown and manufactured radiata pine CLT with the fatter knots and just pop over it a sheet of local plantation grown and manufactured appearance-grade Araucaria plywood in a few spots where this offensive local pine might otherwise show up. So to wrap up on structural timbers for builders who declare, keep copies of this simple guide in your glove box. It's a green light and red light list of structural timbers that are available in Australia. It's regularly updated and it lives on the Mullen Creek website. Share it with your suppliers, your frame fabricators and your carpenters. Yes, local pine that I'm hoping you'll use for your structures is from monocultural plantations of exotic species providing little biodiversity value over the prior grazing land that they've occupied. However, I have a strong view that we should totally avoid sourcing timber from intact and cyclically harvested native forests, whether they be in Australia or abroad. That is until forest management operations there can be warranted under emergency environmental laws, which we need, to secure a net enrichment of local and global ecological and social health, patch by patch, year on year, and employing new DNA and GPS technology to track each stick of wood from standing tree to stair tread. You might ask, why am I so radical and uncompromising in my view? Well, it's because we are in an emergency in which the health of our native forests absolutely needs to take priority over any economic or business objectives. There are some eminent climate scientists now who are saying that protecting these forests may be as crucial to our near-term survival on this planet as stopping our use of fossil fuels. Instead of further depleting our forests, we all need to plant the crap out of our vast acreage of bare and marginally productive grazing land, to plant it out with trees, to soak up atmospheric carbon, to regenerate healthy water cycles, to restore biodiversity, and to provide wood for future generations. So from this, it's a project I undertook with my neighbours in 1995, to this in only 25 years. Okay, so where are the vast bulk of hardwoods for architectural applications commonly sourced? For wall cladding, decking, flooring, joinery and the like. Meranti has now long been a go-to wood for external doors and windows, for internal reveals and architraves, as well as rails and stiles for flush panel doors, because it's cheap and stable, though not at all durable externally, which I'm sure you've all discovered when you replace windows, timber windows. Merbau you'll find very commonly on decks and in window sills and door thresholds. Meranti, Merbau and rosewood are from tropical rainforests of Southeast Asia and PNG. You'll now also see highly durable kumaru and manilkara from the Amazon rainforest, used for external cladding, decks, pergolas, slatted screens, window joinery, flooring, you name it. Often you'll see these species sold with environmental certifications, even Fsc. But if you follow the concerns of Greenpeace International, who helped to set up but have now withdrawn their support from Fsc, reports from the highly respected International Environment Investigation Agency, if you trust the high-res satellite imagery informing Global Forest Watch, and even Interpol, then you'll be convinced, as I am, that illegally harvested timber products from intact native forests of countries with poor governance, they're laundered into legal and often FSC and PEFC certified supply chains all around the world. Whether in Amazonia, Southeast Asia, Central Africa or Northern Australia and PNG, intact tropical rainforests store an extraordinary proportion of the carbon that's sequestered above ground across our planet. The earth below these forests, on the other hand, is poor in carbon because high temperatures and moisture levels at the surface make for rapid decomposition of vegetative litter, mostly back to CO2 and methane. So trees in tall, closed canopy, tropical rainforests are relatively starved for sunlight, for leaf photosynthesis, and soil nutrient for root uptake. And they need that to accumulate starch and to grow. Take these rainforest trees away and you remove a crucial rainmaking water pump from our climate system. You remove this extraordinary carbon store as well as ecosystems that support over half of all plant and animal species on the planet. Add to that the displacement of seeds and soils now exposed to heavy monsoonal and equatorial rains. You're left with nothing to support natural regeneration of anything like what was there for eons before. In your travels, you may have observed the rubbish that grows back where tropical rainforest has been cleared. We simply cannot continue to build with these rainforest species. In Australia, it's our tall and relatively intact sclerophyll forests from which the most durable, stable and attractive native hardwoods for architectural applications are extracted. Cyclical clear felling of tall, wet sclerophyll forests in often mountainous terrain depletes biodiversity and other ecosystem services. It encourages pest, weed and exposure-related tree dieback, just like in those boreal forests, and that then exacerbates wildfire risk. And these damaging impacts are now compounded by a hotter and drier climate. Selective felling of dry sclerophyll forests on the often flatter ground is equally damaging, and in the interest of maximising yield for effort, the harvesters tend to degrade the provenance or pick out the eyes of the tree gene pool. This time last year, our country's high labour costs and slowly raising environmental concern saw at least a good portion of Victoria's remnant native forest protected from logging. Conveniently in these times, we, by that I mean Bunnings, turn again to the tropical rainforests of poor southeastern Asian and Amazonian countries for the Fsc woods that I mentioned just before. Having said that, New South Wales has recently remapped its old-growth forests with a view to opening up previously protected areas of state and private forests for logging. Keep in mind that these southern Australian forests are immensely biologically diverse, and their ability to sequester atmospheric carbon is as good as it gets. Sadly, a year is now a long time for a native forest. In the wake of our horrific black summer, the Australian timber industry is now poised to mechanically thin those native forest reserves that remain intact. It's proposed in the name of fuel reduction, overriding state powers by decree of the federal government's emergency response. Meanwhile, we have a chorus of world-renowned forest ecologists and fire scientists in Australia, people like David Lindenmayer at the ANU, who draw on clear evidence from the field to demonstrate that mechanical thinning of Victoria's tall forests will not lessen fire risk, but instead it'll increase it. The timber lobby is powerful, whilst the central tenet of our global movement to arrest climate and biodiversity collapse is to listen to the peer-reviewed science. Maybe a good moment to talk a bit more about environmental certifications. Fsc certification, which was recently rebadged as responsible wood in Australia, has been devised by and for the global timber industry, and it's attached to all native hardwoods that are sourced from state-owned forests and Crown land across Australia. The environmental standards by which this certified native forest management takes place, it varies from almost okay to quite barbaric. Let me tell you, a good amount of hardwood from unregulated, privately owned native forest also finds its way into these PSC supply chains. As specifiers and purchasers of Australian hardwoods, we have almost no way of knowing where and how ours has been procured. The misinformation and the opacity of it all are gobsmacking. The Fsc Standard is based on a multidisciplinary environmental, social and economic criteria. It's considered more rigorous and independent. It's respected by many environmental organisations, and it enjoys the support of markets that are attuned to sustainability, such as those in Northern Europe. But with a few exceptions, I don't currently have confidence in Fsc or PEFC certified timber products sourced from intact or regenerating native forest anywhere in the world. because the administration, monitoring and auditing of certified forestry operations in poorer regions of Africa, Southeast Asia and South America, it's been widely investigated and deemed to be quite compromised. The timber procured and distributed by big timber business from the transparent West have operations that reach well beyond also to regions where sourcing becomes more and more murky. Consumers are mostly unaware that when a timber distributor sends them a piece of paper declaring that it has FSC certification, the distributor, that actually says nothing about the environmental standard by which a particular timber product that it's distributing has been harvested from the forest. FSC certifications also relate to inferior FSC mix and FSC controlled wood standards. It's all very confusing. When we framed environmentally sensitive timber selection criteria for Mullen Creek, we were confident that FSC certifications attached to timber sourced from Australia and New Zealand were rigorously applied and adequately audited, and we felt that the carbon miles in transportation from forest to site would be minimised with a local, sort of select local strategy. But currently there are no state-owned native forestry operations in Australia that have full FSC certification. So where does that leave us in search of responsible or sensitively sourced architectural timbers and hardwoods in particular? For the Mullen Creek Eco Housing Estate, there was a Section 173 agreement set up between the developer and lot owners, and it requires that the timber for all homes essentially be either from fast-grown plantations established in Australia or New Zealand on land that was previously cleared for grazing or cropping. It could be with a chain of custody proof that it's recycled from a prior construction use or salvaged from a setting where its removal is sure to have no negative economic ecosystem impacts. So not from a native forest or woodland environment. This we assessed on a case-by-case basis in my office as the agent to the developer. Or it could be otherwise regarded as the most responsible for an application that we know of. And so it was included in our approved timber products list. So strict environmental selection criteria of the kind we had at Mullen Creek still allow for good choices. So for wall claddings, dressed or fine sawn hardwoods in shiplap or board and batten profile of durability class 1 sugar gum that you can see here, class 2 spotted gum or class 3 blue gum. These species that were used that were sourced from Mullen Creek, they're available from plantations on farms across Victoria. But you need to make absolutely sure that they're from these farms and not from native forest. They're with densities of 800 to 1,000 kilos per cubic metre, so they're all fire resistant to BEL 29. Dressed or rough sawn shiplap or board and batten cladding in Monterey cypress, Cypressus macrocarpa. This is a moderately durable class 2 to 3 softwood of excellent stability, even when it's green off the soil. It's salvaged from windbreaks that are planted on farms in Victoria and Tasmania that are dying from old age or canker, a disease, or from root waterlogging. Once these narrow exotic hedges are removed, locally indigenous trees and shrubs are usually returned in broader plantings to establish more efficient windbreaks. Finger jointed, laminated and thermally modified, it means cooked at high temperature, fine sawn shiplap cladding, manufactured in New Zealand from plantation pine. It's sold as Abodo Vulcan Hector. It's a durable board supplied pre-finished in long lengths It's a superb product that's reasonably priced in that it's so fast to install. Carter Holt Harvey Shadowclad. It's a 12 thick radiata pine plywood manufactured in New Zealand from local plantation pine there. It's treated for good durability and stability with low toxicity, light organic solvent preservatives, LOSP, and with wax impregnation. Keep the moisture out. It comes with a flush or groove fine sawn face. I suspect most of you are probably familiar with this product. Decking. For bushfire-prone sites, sugar gum is a great decking choice. For fire-safe sites, thermally modified LOSP or ACQ-treated plantation pine decking is available, also in knot-free grades, if that's an aesthetic consideration. Abodo and Hine make a really smart decking of this kind. This Mullum Creek info sheet will help you work out what all the numbers on those little tags on treated pine mean in terms of chemical toxicity. Copper chrome arsenate, or CCA, is obviously the treatment to avoid. But again, pop that in your glove box, and when you're at the timber yard, it'll be really, really easy for you to work out which is the good treated wood and which is the bad stuff. If your clients are comfortable with composite wood plastic decking, Modwood is manufactured in Melbourne from local plantation pine sawmill waste and with recycled PVC milk bottles. It's also available with a Bell 40 bushfire resistance flame shield. All other wood plastic deckings that I know of are best avoided because they're manufactured mostly in countries where OH&S around volatile plastics can be poor, and they often draw on virgin forest and petrochemical resources. Fast-growing plantation hardwoods tend to be relatively reactive to movement as they take up and release seasonal air moisture. So sourcing wood with the right environmental cred for doors and windows, batten screening, flooring and internal joinery is really quite difficult. These are applications that rely on high dimensional stability. Now, I know you guys appreciate how crucial it is to the performance and service life of external doors and windows, but the timber used in their manufacture has terrific stability and durability or light resistance. Timber doors and windows are big ticket items in a home. But it's also easy to forget that only around 7 to 10% of the cost of this joinery as it's supplied to site is in the wood itself. Okay, so it's important not to compromise on wood performance. And if we can't do that by selecting wood that's environmentally responsible, then we should revert to high-performing and reusable or recyclable aluminium door and window frames. But as far as timber windows go, I reckon you can't go past acetylated or pickled plantation pine. It's grown in New Zealand, it's then shipped to Holland for pickling, it then comes back here as a coir, a super durable, clear grade wood. I'm of the view that the extraordinary carbon miles that are currently attached to Australia's supplies of a coir, they're justifiable for now because its sales need to reach a momentum before investment in this brilliant new and environmentally benign treatment technology is going to occur locally. Manufacturing windows with an external aluminium sheathing, that negates the need for durable wood. So the go-to hardwoods for wood alu and wood-only windows manufactured in Victoria and Tasmania, if they're hardwood windows, they're not at all naturally durable. So they're either Vic ash or Tas oak, which is actually properly termed as mountain ash or alpine ash. They're commonly from closed canopy, native wet sclerophyll forests. By definition, trees of these species need to grow slow and tool to develop wood that, once it's milled and seasoned, will achieve the dimensional stability needed for this exacting application in joinery. We really need to stop extracting hardwood from our tall native forests for doors and windows, as well as for flooring and internal joinery. Up in New South Wales and Queensland, these woods that are coming out of those native forests include blackbutt, spotted gum, tallow wood, red and grey ironbark. Over in WA, it's jarrah and karri. Recent closure of a few of Victoria's finest tall forests to logging has us now also importing oak like never before in windows and doors as the wear layer to engineered flooring and as raw seasoned wood for locally manufactured internal joinery. I haven't yet managed to wrap my head around the environmental cred of oak forest management across Western Europe and the eastern states of the USA, but I understand that some oak is extracted from ancient biodiverse forests of Eastern Europe and Russia, and it's finding its way into Australia. So if you're set on selecting timber products of imported oak, insist at least on FSC certification. Of course, there are many merchants around who process recycled wood into cladding, decking, floorboards and joinery timbers. Unless the wood you're looking to buy shows nail holes, bolt holes, or other clear signs of being from a prior construction use, insist on a formal chain of custody declaration. It really annoys me that many of these suppliers assure their customers that their wood is all recycled when in fact it's often salvaged or normally logged from regenerating native forest. I dream of the day when most of us respond to a polished hardwood floor fresh from a biodiverse native forest in the same way as most of us today respond to a fluffy white coat made of polar bears or those cute little minks that I hear have now all got coronavirus. Trees aren't annual crops like turnips. For some decades going forward, we'll need to draw on Australian native timbers that are fast grown on mixed species farm plantations. Wood milled from younger trees can be less dense and therefore less durable, as well as more prone to seasonal swelling and shrinkage, even once seasoned. But we can look to timber engineering, laminating and finger jointing, and we can look to benign thermal and chemical treatments to deliver the durability and the dimensional stability that's required for every application. The approach taken by Obodo Wood Products in New Zealand that I mentioned just before is a terrific example. Engineered flooring that has recycled hardwood as its wear layer, laminated onto a plywood substrate of plantation-grown pine and or shining gum would be another really good way to go. And no reason why we couldn't manufacture an engineered flooring product like this in Tasmania, from rotary peeled shining gum, for example. This one's produced from European beech by Polymer in Germany. In preparing for this presentation, I realised that I'd need to bang on for 3 hours to cover responsible timber selection for all applications, and I wouldn't want to inflict that on anyone. So I encourage you to reference the Mullum Creek approved timber products list whenever you can. It identifies good timber choices across all architectural and engineering applications. If you can work with these, you'll send a strong message to the now global timber industry that you'll entertain only fairly sourced wood. It's a 2-pager, so it takes you through all the different main timber types, hardwood, softwood, recycled timbers, engineered timber products, plywoods, reconstituted wood products, and so forth. And then that's going down the page. Across the page, you've got all the recommended applications that we've sort of spoken through, and where a dot aligns the columns and the And the rose, there's a product there on the right telling you who the manufacturer is or the sawmiller, and the wholesaler or retailer where you can get that wood. Now, if suppliers or the websites they have tell you that their wood is sustainable and it's not on this list, you can be pretty sure that they're telling you a porky. A decade of pretty intensive research has gone into preparation and regular revision of this list and the other Mullen Creek timber info sheets that I've flagged with you. If you're still unsure about a product, please let me know. We're desperate to add responsibly sourced timbers to this list, and we acknowledge that our gaze on Australian-grown wood might be a bit biased to the southeastern states where we practice. At Mullen Creek, we've been really pleased and a little surprised with how designers, and particularly the builders, are with minimal resistance embracing the sustainable timber products we're requiring them to choose from. And we know they're carrying this product awareness onto their other jobs as well, which is great. I'll quickly show you the kind of environmentally responsible timber selection I've been on about and how that can come together. Here it's in a job of mine from a while back, an earth-covered library and wildfire shelter for Candlebark School in the Macedon Ranges. It has a lot of wood in it, and it's all sourced from Australian plantation softwood and recycled hardwood. So the timber portal structure supports a weighty ½ metre of earth over it as cover, which in turn provides impeccable shielding for the bushfire's radiant heat, if one were to come. It's a deconstructible, screw-laminated portal of interlocking 35 and 45 thick LVL billets of only plantation Panaster pine. So it's from Wesbeam in the days before they added the native forest carry. All offcuts from the LVL billets were ripped into purlins, which in turn were screwed down onto the portal beams, so there was no wastage there. And before then, these LVL purlins and their structural plywood roof substrate, like the structural plywood roof substrate, which is Carter Holt Harvey Eco-Ply, had a pre-use as temporary formwork for a concrete slab beam that provides lateral restraint to the curved reinforced concrete block retaining wall. Runs around the outside. The window wall is framed in New South Wales blackbutt, recycled from a Sydney warehouse, a wool store, I think it was. The pergola out front is rough-sawn farm-grown Monterey cypress. It's a non-structural landscape element, so it didn't need to be bell-rated. And the ceilings are hoop pine, Araucaria cunninghamii. So plywood that's manufactured in Queensland from local plantation wood. Over the past 5 years, pretty well everyone in my office has volunteered to team up with Ceres, the Centre for Education and Research in Environmental Strategies. It's in East Brunswick, Melbourne. And they've done that to extend the timber initiative from Mullen Creek into the launch of a new social enterprise, Ceres Fair Wood. The profits of Ceres Fair Wood all go back into Ceres Community Environment Park. Fairwood removes itself from the adversarial native forest debate and opaque environmental certification schemes. Peter and Hayden at Fairwood, they aggregate and retail timber inside short local supply chains with Victorian and Tasmanian tree farmers and portable sawmill operators who they know personally. These are mostly small producers who are geographically dispersed and struggle to find, sell and deliver to a market that fully appreciates the farm-grown trees and timber that they have on offer. Fairwood buys only from growers and millers who source wood to the highest standards of environmental and social responsibility, as informed by the Mullen Creek project. It shares their stories directly with its customers, building and landscape contractors, furniture makers and DIYers. Fairwood Business builds direct friendships and understandings between city and country folk, and it encourages farming families to revegetate their bare paddocks with trees for conservation and for profit. On its website, you'll see that Fairwood has a limited selection of local farm-grown and salvage woods available as decking, wall cladding, flooring, joinery, landscape timber. It's only recently acquired a substantial warehouse that will now allow it to gather larger and broader stocks of very responsibly sourced wood. And finally, as Jessie requested, here are a few broader tips from me to builders who declare. At its core, sustainable building construction must be of excellent quality across and between all trades. Smart detailing and fine workmanship are key. Without it, building fabric is wasted to premature failure and replacement. So when it comes to carpentry and joinery, for example, the technical design guides prepared by Wood Solutions are an excellent resource. They really are. Just be mindful, though, that they're environmentally agnostic in the way they promote all wood products because they're directed by the Forest and Wood Products Australia. Okay, second tip. The manufacture of Portland cement is responsible for a whopping 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's hard to imagine, but it's true. Where possible, insist that a minimum 40% of Portland cement in the concrete, mortar, and the rammed earth walling that you lay, that it's substituted by other equally performing supplementary cementitious materials like slag, which is waste from steel smelting, and fly ash, which is a waste from coal burning. These alternatives for wet mix concrete, as well as bagged cement, are now readily available in Australia, certainly across our major cities, at the batching plants and at your timber hardwares. To massively reduce carbon footprint embedded in your builds with a no-cost, no-brainer, order concrete and cement with SCMs and refer to the Mullen Creek Concrete and Cement Products Guides to make it a complete cinch for you. If you can bear to put up with any more from me, tune into this YouTube of a webinar I presented to Architects Declare back in April. It explains why materials that go into construction account for the lion's share of the total life cycle environmental impact of buildings. Until we can produce materials that are without such negative ecological and climate consequences, let's subscribe to less is more and foster quality over quantity. If you're able to, plead with your clients to build small, explain why, and encourage them to re-love what they've already got. A fine carpenter builder on this little job of mine from a good while back. It was for a family that loves both the Australian bush and all things Japanese. But the builder, he prefers to remember it as one large joinery item rather than as a little house. Craftsmanship will earn you money without costing the earth. Another tip, delicately rework existing buildings where you can. Apply your finest skills to minimise natural resource depletion and to give our planet a chance to heal itself. Accept that a gentle touch may not catch the eye of today's glossy magazines, but know that future life on Earth will be thankful for it. Reworking existing buildings generates a lot of waste. Recycle it responsibly. Check out this guide for ways to manage waste, either yourselves or by outsourcing the task. At Mullen Creek, most builders chose to outsource. And whilst I've spoken highly of some engineered wood products, be mindful that capital-intensive materials, manufacturing processes, don't necessarily improve social sustainability. Keeping things simple can help share work. You can share skills and wealth more broadly. Post-COVID, I think this will be really important. I spent the first 10 years after uni up north, helping Indigenous communities to design and build for themselves, using materials straight out of the local bush. It was stacks of work, but these people had time on their hands and they were keen to learn. By this self-help approach to building, they got to own their own homes. They built these homes at a tiny fraction of the cost of the government homes they'd been renting. And it also built community and social resilience. So for me, these days, I tend to get knotted up too often in unnecessary complexity. And my final tip, share what you learn freely. Do it desperately and urgently, because this is an emergency. So thank you, everyone.